7:47 a.m., Homer Harbor, Alaska. Three vessels moved into position simultaneously, running dark, engines throttled to idle. No lights, no radio traffic. The only sound was Cook Inlet water slapping against aluminum hulls and dock lines groaning in the pre-dawn wind. On the pier, a U.S. Marshals tactical team held position behind stacked crab pots, weapons up, waiting for the signal. 40 feet away, tied to slip 7 on the Homer Spit commercial dock, a 58-foot crab boat sat quiet and still. Lights off, crew asleep. The man in the forward bunk had been running for 17 months. He had cleared every database check, every facial recognition sweep, every tip line the Marshals activated. He had built a life so ordinary, so deliberately unremarkable, that it functioned as its own camouflage. It ended in 41 seconds. That was how long it took a biometric scan, run aboard this same vessel 9 days earlier, to return a match against the federal Fugitive database. 41 seconds to surface a man who had spent a year and a half convinced he had vanished completely. His name on the indictment was Daniel Garrett Ferris, 9-year veteran of ICE Homeland Security Investigations, field-rated special agent, Phoenix Division. A man who had spent nearly a decade building federal cases against human smuggling networks, and who had spent the last 3 years of that career systematically selling those networks everything they needed to survive. The full picture, what Ferris handed over, who received it, and how the money moved, is still being assembled in federal court in the District of Arizona. What investigators have comes from 14 months of sealed grand jury proceedings. It was not a tip that cracked it. It was an internal access log. Ferris's supervisor flagged an entry that should not have been there, pulled the record, and handed it to federal agents. The raid came shortly after. This is that case. Ferris joined HSI in 2015 after 6 years with Customs and Border Protection, where he had an unremarkable but solid record. He spoke functional Spanish. He had worked 3 cross-border smuggling prosecutions that resulted in convictions. He was promoted to the Phoenix field office in 2017 and assigned to the human smuggling unit. By 2020, he was a mid-level agent with access to 2 systems that together made up one of the most sensitive data environments in federal law enforcement: the detainee scheduling database, which tracked when individuals in ICE custody were scheduled for transfer, release, or processing, and the confidential informant registry, which cataloged the identities, cover arrangements, and active status of every human asset the Phoenix office was running. Ferris did not need an elaborate network. Federal agents raiding his vessel later found no encrypted hard drives, no burner phones, no handler. What they found was a single contact, a single route, and a courier who made the same run every time. The kind of operation that stays invisible because it never gets complicated enough to leave a trail. He made contact with a logistics coordinator working for a human smuggling brokerage based in Tijuana. The brokerage, which federal documents describe as operating under the cover of a freight and warehousing firm, was running migrants across the Arizona and California border corridors at volume. Their primary operational problem was the same one every smuggling organization faces at scale: informants inside the network, and federal interdiction timed to their movements. Both problems could be solved if someone inside HSI was willing to provide advance information. Ferris was willing. Over roughly 3 years, beginning in late 2020, Ferris provided the Tijuana brokerage with 2 categories of information. First, scheduled release and transfer windows for detainees the brokerage had flagged as potential informants or as individuals who could identify network members. This let the brokerage assess exposure and manage contact before federal debriefs could occur. Second, and more critically, Ferris provided names, informant identities, individuals who had agreed to cooperate with HSI in exchange for consideration on their own immigration proceedings, people who believed the federal government was protecting them. I spent time going through the case documents that were eventually unsealed, and one detail kept repeating in the indictment language, the phrase thereby placing said individuals at serious risk of harm. It appears 11 times. The prosecutors were not being rhetorical. At least 2 confidential informants whose identities Ferris sold were forced to relocate after the brokerage identified them. A third disappeared entirely before federal investigators could determine what had happened. Cash payments. Structured, untraceable, hand-delivered. Investigators tracking Ferris's finances through evidence collected at the arrest scene documented an estimated $1.6 million moving over 3 years, broken into amounts small enough to avoid reporting thresholds. The money flowed into a nominee company registered in Belize. Forensic investigators reconstructing the paper trail believe Ferris had that structure in place before the first payment was ever made. That is the part that defines what this case actually was. Not a corrupt agent who got greedy and improvised. A corrupt agent who planned the corruption, planned the cover, and planned the disappearance in parallel. All 3 tracks were running simultaneously. The fallback identity started taking shape in 2019. Investigators reconstructing the scheme from forensic records found that Ferris had identified a deceased Michigan resident, intact birth records, no surviving family, no employment or credit history after 1987. Through what a federal affidavit describes as a private records broker, Ferris built a second identity in that name: a social security record, a Michigan driver's license, and a United States Coast Guard merchant mariner credential. On any checkpoint screen, he was a different man. The mariner credential is issued by the Coast Guard National Maritime Center and authorizes the holder to work as a licensed crew member on U.S. commercial vessels. It requires documentation, medical clearance, and proficiency training, but it does not require fingerprints as part of the standard issuance process for certain endorsement categories. Ferris obtained his in 2021 under the stolen identity. He listed a commercial fishing endorsement as his area of qualification. He completed the required training in 2 courses taken in different states, using different contact addresses each time. By 2022, he was taking extended leave from HSI, traveling to Alaska under the false name, and establishing himself as a working commercial fisherman in the Homer area. He crewed 2 seasons on existing vessels as a deckhand before beginning to develop his own operation. The HSI internal access log anomaly that triggered the investigation was discovered in November 2024 by a supervisory agent conducting a routine audit of the confidential informant registry. The system tracked every access event by user, timestamp, and record pulled. Ferris had accessed 23 confidential informant records over a 14-month period that did not correspond to any active case he was assigned to. The records he pulled were in cases handled by 4 different agent teams. There was no supervisory authorization logged for any of the excesses. The supervisor flagged the anomaly and escalated to the HSI Office of Professional Responsibility. OPR opened an inquiry the same week. That inquiry ran in parallel with field operations for 11 days before it was transferred to the FBI's Public Corruption Unit and the U.S. Marshals Service, which took primary fugitive tracking responsibility. During those 11 days, Ferris continued reporting to work normally. Then, on a Friday afternoon in late November 2024, he clocked out of the Phoenix field office at the end of a normal shift. He drove to long-term parking at Sky Harbor International Airport. He left his vehicle in the lot, he walked into the terminal, and he did not get on a plane. He walked out a secondary exit, got into a vehicle he had pre-positioned, and drove north. The indictment unsealed 6 days later charged Ferris on 4 counts: bribery of a public official, conspiracy to commit unauthorized disclosure of law enforcement sensitive information, unauthorized disclosure itself, and conspiracy to smuggle aliens for financial gain. Maximum exposure on the combined charges: 65 years. His vehicle was recovered from the Sky Harbor lot the same day the indictment unsealed. In the glove box, his HSI credentials, his service weapon, his government-issued phone. He had left all 3 deliberately. No phone meant no GPS, no cards meant no transaction trail, no return to any prior address meant no surveillance anchor. The Marshals Fugitive Task Force opened on Ferris within 24 hours of the indictment, knowing all of this. What this case shows clearly is the gap between the theory and reality of fugitive hunting today.
The assumption has always been that digital infrastructure makes disappearing impossible. Bank transactions, facial recognition at airports, phone location data, vehicle plate readers. The conventional wisdom is that you cannot run. Ferris understood this and he built around it. No digital footprint is not a miracle, it is a methodology. And for 17 months, the methodology held. The Marshals Task Force worked the case with what a federal case summary later described as comprehensive investigative measures across multiple jurisdictions. In practice, they pulled every thread Ferris had touched in the 2 years before his disappearance. Travel records, fishing licenses applied for in multiple Western states, equipment purchases, boat slip rental inquiries. They found fragments.
A fishing gear purchase in Anchorage in 2022, a vessel inspection query from Homer in 2023, a crab pot supplier in the Kenai Peninsula who remembered a man matching Ferris's physical description buying a substantial amount of commercial-grade gear for cash over 2 separate visits. None of it was enough to locate him directly. Each data point was weeks or months stale by the time investigators reached it. The task force consulted the Coast Guard's Commercial Fisheries Division about whether an individual attempting to build a low-visibility life in the Alaskan fishing community could do so effectively using a fraudulent mariner credential. The answer was yes, under normal circumstances. The Cook Inlet crab fishery operates under Alaska Department of Fish and Game regulations and Coast Guard safety oversight, but day-to-day documentation checks are infrequent. A licensed operator with a clean vessel inspection record and no reported violations would typically go months without any interaction that would trigger a credential verification against federal databases. Here's the thing. This wasn't supposed to hold. One sweep through the Commercial Mariner database against the Fugitive Registry should have surfaced the name on Ferris's false credential within weeks. The system existed. The connection should have been made automatically. It wasn't, because the false name Ferris had chosen had no flags in any federal system. The deceased Michigan resident had never been arrested, never applied for federal benefits, never appeared in any enforcement database. The credential lookup hit a clean record and returned clean. The system worked exactly as designed. It simply had no way to know the person presenting the credential no longer existed. The break came from a pilot program that had not existed when Ferris built his exit plan. In October 2025, the Coast Guard and NOAA Fisheries jointly launched a biometric verification pilot for commercial fisheries observer deployments. The program was designed to address a separate problem: concerns about observer identity fraud and the manipulation of fisheries monitoring data. It allowed observers assigned to vessels to run a quick biometric check on key crew members using a tablet-based system that queried both the Mariner credential database and, through a DHS integration layer added as part of the pilot, the Federal Fugitive Warrant Registry. What Ferris had not accounted for was a system that did not exist when he first mapped the credential vulnerabilities in 2020. The integration layer was built in 2024 and activated in October 2025 as part of the biometric pilot rollout. Surveillance monitor footage from the dispatch center shows the flag it generated the first time his credential was scanned under the new system. A silent alert, logged automatically, forwarded to federal agents before Ferris had left the dock. In April 2026, a NOAA fisheries observer was randomly assigned to Ferris's vessel for a 2-week Bering Sea crab run. Standard procedure under the pilot program, upon boarding, the observer ran a quick biometric check of the vessel operator. One detail that has stayed with me in reviewing this case: Ferris had crewed 3 previous observer-monitored trips without incident. The biometric component of the pilot was not mandatory fleet-wide in April 2026. It applied only to vessels in the pilot program's randomized sample pool. Ferris's vessel was selected by an algorithm that rotated through a list of registered commercial crab operators in the Cook Inlet and Bering Sea zones. Random selection. Algorithm. 41 seconds. The observer's tablet returned a match against the Marshals Service fugitive warrant record at 22:03 p.m. on April 14, 2026. The observer, trained on protocol for the exact scenario, did not confront the vessel operator. He completed the boarding procedure normally, conducted the scheduled fisheries observation, and disembarked at the end of the trip. He filed the biometric match report through the observer coordination system within 4 hours. The Marshals Service Fugitive Task Force received the notification through the DHS integration channel the same evening. 9 days of preparation followed. The task force could not move immediately. Tactical entry on a commercial vessel in an active harbor required coordination with the Coast Guard, whose jurisdiction over documented commercial vessels created concurrent authority questions. Alaska State Troopers had to be looped in under the Marshals Interagency Protocol. And critically, the task force needed to verify that Ferris would be on the vessel when they moved, not ashore in Homer, where the tactical picture became significantly more complicated. Surveillance confirmed vessel location daily. Ferris, operating under his false name, maintained a predictable schedule. He slept aboard the boat most nights when not actively running. He had one deckhand, a seasonal worker who had no knowledge of Ferris's actual identity. The takedown was scheduled for 4:47 a.m. on April 23, 2026. Would you have noticed anything off about the man on that boat if you'd worked the slip next to him for 2 years? By every account from the Homer fishing community, the answer is no. He was quiet. He paid his bills on time. He maintained his gear. He did not drink heavily, did not cause conflict, did not draw attention. He had built a persona so functional that it had become, for all practical purposes, a real person. 3 vessels moved into position simultaneously at 4:46 a.m. 2 Coast Guard law enforcement boats flanking the slip, 1 Marshals tactical vehicle on the pier, Alaska State Troopers at the harbor perimeter, controlling access. The entry team breached the vessel at 4:47 a.m. Ferris was taken from his forward bunk without resistance. No shots fired. The deckhand, in the aft bunk, was detained briefly and released at the scene after confirming he had no knowledge of the operator's true identity. On-scene recovery, a concealed compartment located behind the engine room bulkhead, accessible through a false panel that had been professionally installed and would not have been discovered in a routine Coast Guard safety inspection. Inside the compartment, $340,000 in bundled U.S. currency, a Canadian passport and a third identity, distinct from both his real name and his false Mariner credential name, a prepaid burner phone containing 2 dormant contact numbers. The phone's storage had been wiped at some point, but forensic extraction recovered fragments of 2 encrypted message threads from 2025. The deckhand later told investigators that he had worked the vessel for 2 full seasons and had never been allowed into the engine room without the operator present. We'll say what most coverage of this case has avoided: the system that caught Ferris caught him almost by accident. The biometric pilot that surfaced him was underfunded, underdeployed, and scheduled for a continuation review in 2027 based on budget constraints. If the program had been canceled a year earlier, or if Ferris's vessel had not appeared in the random sample pool, it is entirely plausible he would still be running crab pots in Cook Inlet. 17 months of fugitive investigation by one of the most capable task forces in federal law enforcement produced leads, not a location. A randomized algorithm produced a location in 41 seconds. That is uncomfortable for an institution built on investigative methodology. Federal agents are still pulling on the threads Ferris left behind. Evidence collection ongoing, couriers identified but not yet charged, the Belize holding company still under forensic review. The vessel sits in Juneau. Slip 7 stays empty. And somewhere in the sealed record from the District of Arizona, investigators say there are names that have not surfaced yet. The deckhand's name has not been released. He cooperated fully with investigators. He had no criminal history and no prior contact with federal law enforcement. He lost his seasonal employment when the vessel was seized as a potential asset in the forfeiture proceeding. Ferris was transported by road to Anchorage, then by federal air transfer to Phoenix. He appeared before a magistrate judge in the District of Arizona within 72 hours of his arrest. He entered no plea at the initial hearing. His defense attorney, appointed from the federal public defender roster, requested a continuance. The judge granted 30 days. The identities of the confidential informants whose names Ferris sold to the Tijuana brokerage have not been publicly disclosed. 2 of them have been formally notified that their cooperation was compromised. The third remains unlocated. Federal investigators describe the search for that individual as ongoing. The Belize Marine Services LLC, used to receive Ferris's payments, has been dissolved, but the full cash flow through that entity has not been reconstructed. Of the $1.6 million in estimated proceeds, $340,000 was recovered at the vessel. The remainder has not been found. Investigators believe at least part of it was converted to other assets, possibly including the Canadian passport and the vessel itself. But the full movement of funds remains an open question in the financial investigation. The Tijuana brokerage that operated as Ferris's buyer has not been charged in U.S. courts. Mexican federal law enforcement was notified through the DEA's cross-border coordination channel. As of August 2026, the brokerage's principal operators remain outside U.S. jurisdiction. The confidential informant who disappeared before federal investigators could reach them has not been found. Ferris is awaiting trial. The case proceeds in the District of Arizona. Comment below, do you think a case like this could have been cracked faster, or was the methodology Ferris used genuinely close to bulletproof until the technology caught up? Body camera footage from the arrest at Slip 7 in Homer shows a quiet harbor. Fishing vessels, flat water, nothing moving. That slip is empty now. The vessel is in federal custody at a Coast Guard facility in Juneau. The biometric pilot program that surfaced Ferris goes to budget review in 7 months. The network he served is still operating. This case is still open. Subscribe so you are there when we cover what comes next, because federal agents are still working it, and the next arrest in this file may not be far off.